Hello there, and welcome to Dreamoria. I'm Marv, and tonight I will be telling you the story of Ramses II, the great pharaoh who ruled ancient Egypt for more than 60 years. We will wander slowly through his life, from a young prince walking the halls of temples along the Nile, to a ruler who led armies into distant lands, carved his image into mountains, and filled Egypt with monuments to his name. Together, we will visit his battles and his treaties, his family and his palaces, and the long shadow he cast over history even after his death. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like and subscribe. It is the easiest way to support this channel, and it helps me bring you more journeys into the past. Thank you for being here with me. If you wish, you can close your eyes, let your shoulders soften, and feel the day slowly fade away. The Nile at dawn was a long ribbon of pale blue, still and patient under the first light, when a child, who would later be called Ramses the Great, was carried into the world of ancient Egypt. The date that modern scholars give for his birth is around the year 1303, before the Common Era, during the age that we know as the New Kingdom. At that time, Egypt was once again a proud and ambitious state. It had survived religious upheaval, civil unrest, and a crisis of confidence, and was now trying to steady itself under a new royal family. Ramses was not born into a long-established dynasty. His grandfather had begun his life as a common soldier in the Delta, serving a previous king. That grandfather, a man also named Ramesses, rose by skill and loyalty through the ranks of the army until he caught the eye of Horemheb, the stern general who had seized the throne after the disastrous reign of Akhenaten. Horemheb had seen the country fractured by a new cult that had tried to set aside the old gods in favor of the sun disk alone. By the time he died, he wanted to make sure that Egypt would never again endure such confusion. He turned to his trusted officer, this Ramesses from the north, and placed the future of the throne in his hands. The soldier king became Ramesses I, though his time in power was brief. His son, Seti, inherited not only the double crown of Egypt, but also a mission. The kingdom, which had once extended its influence far into the lands of Syria and Canaan, needed to reclaim its pride. Seti had the temperament of a commander and the imagination of a builder. Under his rule, the country regained some of its lost territory, and its temples began to rise again from the ruins of neglect. It was into this world of renewed confidence, under the watchful eyes of Seti and his queen Tuya, that a son named Ramesses was born. We can imagine the palace in which the child spent his earliest years. It would have stood near the Nile, perhaps in the royal residences that shifted between Memphis and the great religious center of Thebes. The air would have smelled of river mud, lotus blossoms, and incense from nearby shrines. The boy would have heard the constant murmur of servants, the slap of sandals on stone floors, and the distant roar of drums when messengers arrived from the frontiers. The rhythm of his days would be marked by processions to the temple of Amun, where his father appeared in bright linen and gold, wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt or the red crown of Lower Egypt, a mortal man who had to act as a god. The first stories the child heard were not fairy tales in the sense that we know them. They were stories of the gods who shaped the world and of kings who had walked with those gods. A nurse or tutor might have told him how Ra sailed his solar bark across the sky each day, or how Osiris had been murdered and resurrected, becoming Lord of the Dead. Soon he would hear that he too was part of this great chain, that he belonged to the royal bloodline that linked living rulers to divine ancestors. For Ramesses, this was not only a comforting idea, it was also a heavy cloak of expectation. From an early age, royal boys were trained not merely to be princes, but to be administrators and warriors. The education of Ramesses would have been both practical and ceremonial. On one day, he might sit with scribes, who guided his hand as he learned to shape the elegant forms of hieroglyphs. On another, he would be taught by military tutors how to string a bow, how to stand steady in a chariot as the horses moved beneath him, and how to read the landscape of the Nile Valley for signs of flood and drought. There was also another kind of training, harder to describe but just as important. The young prince was taught how to be watched. Whenever he entered a courtyard, eyes followed him. Priests studied him during rituals, checking that he carried the right composure of a future king. Foreign envoys glanced at him in the shadow of columns, wondering what kind of ruler he would one day become. Servants grew still when he passed. This constant attention, which might crush another child, shaped Ramesses into a boy who understood that he was always performing a role. Seti did not keep his son hidden in the palace. He took him on inspection tours along the Nile so that the boy could see the temples under construction and the farmers at work in the fields. These journeys taught the young prince how much labor and organization lay beneath the smooth surface of royal life. He saw gangs of workers hauling stone blocks from quarries, overseers keeping careful records on ostraka, and priests arguing over temple offerings. Perhaps he stood on the deck of the royal barge beside his father, watching the long green banks glide by, learning which nomes supported the throne without complaint and which districts needed more careful handling. When Seti prepared for war, he made sure that his son was close at hand. There is an image carved into the walls of a temple at Karnak that shows Seti striking down enemies beneath the approving gaze of the gods. Behind him, not yet the tall figure he would later become, stands the young Ramesses, holding a ceremonial staff. This scene is more than art. It is a signal to the gods and to the people of Egypt that the line of power has already begun to move from father to son, and that the boy has been admitted into the company of warriors. One of the most striking episodes from Ramesses' early life involved a very real threat that came from the sea. In the Mediterranean, plundering bands of sailors, sometimes called sea peoples, harassed the coasts and the mouths of rivers. Among them were the Sherdon, well armed and skilled in naval raids. Seti, who had to protect Egypt's shipping lanes and delta towns, organized a response. It is recorded that he entrusted a major part of the command to his son. That son, still a teenager, was given the responsibility of confronting seasoned raiders. We can picture the scene. A flotilla of Egyptian ships moves along the coast, oars beating the water in unison. On deck, archers stand ready with bows and arrows. At the center of this force stands the vessel that carries the prince. Ramesses would be dressed in a shorter military kilt, chest bare but adorned with a broad collar of colored stones, his head protected by a leather helmet. As the Sherdon approach, their own ships slicing through the waves, the Egyptians spring their trap. Archers unleash volleys, sailors ram the raider vessels, and soldiers leap from deck to deck with spears and axes. By the end of the battle, the sea is littered with splintered hulls, and a number of Sherdon have been taken prisoner. The records tell us that these Sherdon did not all end their lives in chains. Some were impressed by the prince's courage and skill, and in time many of them were enrolled into his personal guard. It is a revealing moment. Ramesses did not only defeat his enemies, he also saw their value and brought them into his service. In this way, he gained not only a victory, but a corps of experienced warriors who would later ride beside him in formal processions and in real battles. As the years passed, Seti came to rely on his son more and more. The prince accompanied him on campaigns into Canaan, where Egyptian forces sought to re-establish authority over restless vassal kings. He would have ridden in a chariot along dusty roads that led toward fortified towns, watched negotiation turn to siege, and seen firsthand how tribute was collected and recorded. He also traveled south into Nubia, where gold mines and trade routes had to be protected. Each journey added another layer of experience to his understanding of how an empire functioned at its edges. At home, Seti began to share the symbols of power with his son. At some point, the young Ramesses was named co-regent, which meant that he was king alongside his father. Not only in waiting, in inscriptions from this period, their names appear together. Sometimes the father leads and the son follows. In other scenes, Ramesses stands alone, making offerings to the gods or presenting himself as a builder of temples. For the people reading these texts, the message was clear. When the time came, there would be no doubt about who would wear the double crown. Seti himself was deeply engaged in religious architecture. He began work on a magnificent temple at Abydos, the city sacred to Osiris. The temple complex, carefully aligned and richly decorated, was intended to link the royal family to the cosmic order of the gods. Ramesses grew up watching these stones being raised, watching artisans carve scenes of ritual, of sacred boats and divine processions into the walls. He learned that stone could be a kind of memory. What you built and what you inscribed could outlast your own body. It was a lesson that would later guide almost every choice in his reign. In the courts of Thebes, the high priest of Amun played a central role in both spiritual and political life. Seti, understanding the influence of this priesthood, made strategic appointments. When he placed the man Nebuenenef in the high office at Karnak, it was a signal that the crown and the temple were once again in harmony after the doctrinal experiments of earlier rulers. Ramesses saw very clearly that any successful king had to manage this fragile balance between royal authority and religious power. He watched the dignified high priest carry out rituals and understood that the approval of Amun would always be a necessary cloak over the ambitions of a pharaoh. The moment when the balance of life tips from father to son may come suddenly, but it is usually the result of years of preparation. At some time in the late 1370s before the Common Era, Seti died. The sources leave the exact circumstances quiet, as they often do. Perhaps it was illness, perhaps the natural end of a life shaped by war and responsibility. Ramesses, now in his mid-20s, stood at the side of his father's funeral bier and watched the embalmers and priests prepare the body for its journey to the next world. He had seen death before on the battlefield, but this would have felt different. The figure who had been both a father and a master, both an example and a stern judge, was now being wrapped in linen and laid to rest in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. After the period of mourning came the moment the entire royal household had been moving toward. The coronation of Ramesses took place under the rising sun of Thebes, the city that had become the beating heart of royal ritual. The ceremonies followed a pattern shaped over centuries. The young king walked into the great temple of Amun, through courtyards lined with columns, the air heavy with incense and the sound of sistrums. Within the inner sanctum, where only the king and the high priest could enter. The small statue of the god rested in its shrine. The high priest presented the double crown to the new pharaoh. Ramses lifted it and placed it on his head, symbolically taking upon himself the burden of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Stepping out again into the open court, he appeared before the people not as a prince but as the living Horus on earth. Trumpets sounded, standards bearing images of sacred animals swayed. A cheer rose from the assembled crowd. For many of them, this was the first time they had seen him not as the son of Seti but as the embodiment of royal authority in his own right. His first acts as king were a blend of personal loyalty and public statement. He traveled to Abydos to continue and complete the temple that his father had begun. In doing so, he honored Seti and assured the priesthood that there would be continuity, not rupture. That temple would eventually include a long list of the kings of Egypt carved into its walls, a lineage that Ramesses now joined. He also turned his attention to the north. In the eastern reaches of the delta, near older sites that had served as royal residences in previous centuries, he began to develop a new city. This city would later be known by the name Per-Ramessu. In the language of ancient Egypt, the phrase meant the House of Ramesses. It would serve as a seat of power closer to the Asiatic frontiers, a place where the king could watch over the contested territories of Canaan and Syria and respond swiftly to any threat. It would also be a showcase of his vision. The canals, gardens, palaces, and stables of this city spoke not only of military readiness, but of his desire to leave a mark on the map itself. In this new capital, he surrounded himself with officials who were both loyal and experienced. Some had served under his father and even under his grandfather. Others were younger men whose careers would rise and fall with his own fortunes. Among them were scribes, generals, and builders. Ramesses listened to their reports and suggestions, but he also gave clear signs that ultimate decisions would be his. He had watched how authority was exercised, and he intended to improve on the model rather than simply repeat it. In Thebes, Memphis, Abydos, and the Delta, the image of Ramesses began to appear everywhere. Sculptors carved his face onto statues of granite and sandstone. Artists painted him on the walls of temples, offering incense to the gods, presenting Mat, the principle of order and justice, to the divine world. Each of these images served a purpose. They reassured the people that a strong hand guided the state. They reassured the gods, or at least the priests who spoke for them, that the rituals would continue and that Egypt would remain the land where the sun god rose in glory each day. Yet behind the impressive images there were real dangers. To the north, the Hittite Empire watched Egypt carefully. In the Levant, local rulers weighed their chances and wondered whether they might throw off Egyptian control. To the west, Libyan tribes troubled the border. To the south, Nubia offered both wealth and potential unrest. Ramesses had been born into a house of soldiers, and his early life had prepared him not for a quiet reign but for a long contest along the edges of his realm. In the evenings, as the new king walked through the courtyards of his palace, he would have heard the murmur of distant conversations, generals speaking in low voices about troop movements, envoys from distant cities pleading their cases, priests debating the correct interpretation of omens. Somewhere among those sounds, in the mind of the young pharaoh, a resolve took shape. He would not be content merely to preserve what his father had regained. He would push Egypt outward again, assert its strength, make his own generation worthy of the stories that his tutors had told him as a boy. The childhood of Ramesses had come to an end on the day that the crown touched his brow. Now the son of Seti stood poised between memory and ambition, between the carved stones of his father's temples and the unmarked lands that beckoned beyond the frontier. The river flowed on as it had for ages, carrying the reflections of the palace walls and temple pylons. Somewhere upriver and somewhere downriver, farmers continued to tend their fields as they always had. But for a moment, as the first full year of his reign began, the entire course of Egypt's history seemed to narrow down to the will of one man, newly anointed, standing on a palace balcony and looking north toward the distant lands where his destiny would be tested. The great river that had carried Ramesses from childhood into power did not stop to mark the change in his life, but the world around him was shifting. When he settled on the throne, Egypt stood once again among the major powers of its age, yet it was hemmed in by rivals on land that lay far beyond the quiet fields of the Nile. To the north, across deserts and rocky uplands, another empire had risen. It called itself the land of Hatti, and it watched Egypt with the wary respect that one predator grants another. For generations, the lands in between Egypt and Hatti had been a contested zone. The towns of Canaan, the ports along the Levantine coast, the fortresses perched on ridges above the Orontes River had known Egyptian governors, Hittite envoys, and local dynasts who tried to play one against the other. Among these places, there was one city whose name appears again and again in the carved stones of Egypt and in the baked tablets of Hatti. That city was Kadesh. Kadesh sat on a loop of the Orontes, where routes from the north, the east, and the south converged. Whoever held Kadesh could claim to watch over traffic between Anatolia and the Levant, between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean. Ramesses' own father, Seti, had marched north and planted the Egyptian flag there, only for the Hittites to steal it back once he withdrew. For Ramesses, that earlier campaign was both an example and a provocation. He had grown up hearing of the struggle for Kadesh. Now, as king, he wanted the city not as a temporary prize, but as a jewel of his own making. In the quiet inner chambers of his new capital in the Delta, Per-Ramesu, one can imagine the young pharaoh unrolling maps on a polished stone table. Beside him stand his generals and scribes. The generals have spent their careers pacing out the distance between border fortresses. The scribes have filled rolls of papyrus with lists of supplies, troop counts, and dispatches from northern vassals who complain about Hittite pressure. Together they trace the route from Egypt's frontier fortress at Sile through Canaan, with stops at Gaza and further north to the plains of Amuru and the bend of the Orontes. The plan that emerges is bold and simple. Ramesses will lead the army of Egypt north to knock on the gates of Kadesh and to announce that the son of Seti has come to finish what his father began. The army that he gathers is more than a collection of soldiers. It is a moving piece of the social order of Egypt. At its core stand 4 great divisions, each named after a god. There is the division of Amun, patron of Thebes and of kingship itself. There is the division of Ra, the sun god whose voyage across the sky gives light to the world. There is the division of Ptah, the creator god, venerated in Memphis. And there is the division of Set, a tempestuous god linked to the eastern frontier and the storms of war. Each division contains thousands of infantry, charioteers, drivers, and support personnel. Each has its own officers, standards, and scribes who will later record their deeds for the royal archives. Ramses places himself at the head of the division of Amun. Close to him rides his personal guard, which now includes some of the Sheridan warriors who once harried Egypt's coasts and now serve the king as elite bodyguards. They are easy to recognize, with their round shields, horned helmets, and heavy swords. The physicians, the royal household staff, and the priests who will conduct rites during the campaign also travel with the army. To move this host is to move a small city. There are long files of pack donkeys bearing grain, dried fish, and pottery jars of beer. There are artisans who can repair damaged chariots and weapons. There are even singers and trumpeters to sound signals in battle and to entertain the men around their campfires at night. When the campaign season arrives, perhaps in the year that we translate as 1274 before the Common Era, the army leaves the cultivated lands and marches into the desert corridors that point toward Asia. The troops follow the older military route that Egyptian scribes call the Way of Horus, a chain of wells, fortresses, and supply depots stretching toward the northeast. At each station, carved stele and painted scenes remind the soldiers that they are following in the footsteps of earlier kings. Ramesses may have paused at some of these sites to give speeches to his troops, promising them glory, plunder, and the favor of the gods if they stand firm under his banner. As the army moves further into Canaan, the fields of Egypt give way to rougher ground. The men pass through vassal cities whose local rulers hurry out with tribute and excuses. Some prostrate themselves in the dust before the Egyptian king, insisting that they have always remained faithful and that any hints of rebellion come from their enemies. Ramesses listens with the expression of someone who has heard many such declarations. He leaves behind garrisons and officials to keep an eye on these towns, then pushes on. Always, the horizon draws him toward Kadesh. In the lands to the north, on the other side of the Orontes, the Hittite king, Muwatalli, has not been idle. He too has received reports. He knows that the young pharaoh is on the move, and he has no intention of letting Kadesh fall without a fight. From his capital at Hattusa and from his estates in northern Syria, he calls up contingents from across his realm. There are charioteers from Anatolia, warriors from Carchemish, and allies from as far away as Arzawa and Ugarit. Some of these men speak languages quite different from the court language of Hatti. What unites them is their obligation to their king and his promise of reward. The Hittite host that gathers near Kadesh is formidable. While the Egyptian chariot is built for speed, carrying an archer and a driver who can move swiftly around enemy formations, many Hittite chariots are heavier, built to carry 3 men. They are less nimble, but they offer a platform from which a small team of warriors can strike with spears and javelins at close range. On the flat plains near Kadesh, where the Orontes bends and leaves wide spaces of open ground, such machines of war can be devastating if they catch an enemy at the wrong moment. As Ramesses approaches the area south of Kadesh, he faces the constant problem of any commander in unfamiliar territory. He must know not only where he is, but also where the enemy is. Scouts are sent out ahead of the marching columns to find water sources and to watch for dust clouds that might mark the approach of enemy chariots. It is at this point in the story that we hear of two men who stumble into the Egyptian camp. They claim to be deserting from the Hittite army. They tell Ramses that Muwatalli is far to the north, still gathering his forces. If their story is true, it means that Ramses can approach Kadesh without fear of immediate attack. Whether through overconfidence, fatigue, or the natural wish to believe good news, Ramses accepts their report. His army is spread out along the road, with each division separated from the others by a significant distance. He pushes ahead with the division of Amun, eager to be the first to reach the vicinity of Kadesh and to prepare for a formal assault on the city. He crosses the Orontes at a ford south of the town and makes camp to the northwest of the city on a plateau. His pavilion is set up, the royal chariot is parked nearby, and the scribes begin to record the movements of their king. As the day wears on, the camp of Amun seems calm, but further south, the division of Ra is still on the march, vulnerable to anything that might be waiting beyond the next ridge. It is now that the truth begins to break through. Egyptian scouts captured 2 more men who are in fact genuine Hittites. These prisoners are beaten and interrogated until they confess that the Hittite king is not far away at all. He is very close, concealed with his entire army on the far side of Kadesh, hidden behind the town and the river, waiting for the moment when he can fall upon the Egyptian columns as they stretch across the countryside. When this news reaches Ramses, it is as if the ground beneath his feet has shifted. In later inscriptions, he is shown raging at his officers, accusing them of failing to gather proper intelligence and of trusting the first story that pleased them. It is a very human moment, a proud monarch discovering that he has been deceived and that his own judgment has been flawed. There is no time for extended recriminations, however, because the disaster he now fears is already beginning. The Hittite chariots, sensing their chance, cross the Orontes to the south and race in waves toward the unsuspecting division of Ra. From the perspective of those Egyptian soldiers, the attack must have seemed like a thunderstorm rolling out of clear blue sky. One moment, they are marching along the road, dusty and tired from the journey, their ranks stretched out, their baggage train and followers mixed among the fighting men. The next moment, they hear the growing roar of wheels and hooves. A line of Hittite chariots comes surging over the rise, dust streaming behind them. The first wave slams into the head of the Ra column, scattering men, crushing those who are too slow to move aside, splitting the division into fragments. Panic spreads faster than any command can contain it. Some soldiers throw down their shields and run toward the river. Others try to form improvised lines, only to be torn apart as more chariots punch through. The roads and fields between the Ra division and the camp of Amun become a scene of chaos. Baggage animals bolt, carts overturn. The dust becomes so thick that men can barely see who is friend and who is enemy. Fragments of the broken division flee toward the camp where Ramses is trying to impose order. For a moment it looks as if the Hittites may drive straight through these scattered groups, burst into the camp itself, and capture the pharaoh in his own pavilion. In the reliefs that Ramses later ordered carved on temple walls, he is shown standing in his chariot, his arms drawing back a bow, loosing arrow after arrow at the approaching chariots while his horses rear and surge forward. The text that accompanies these scenes tells us that he found himself abandoned by his frightened officers, left alone to face the enemy with only a small circle of bodyguards and his own courage. It is clear that the reality must have been more complicated. An army as disciplined as Egypt's could not have completely dissolved around its king. Yet there is no doubt that for a crucial span of time, Ramesses and the core of the Amun division were forced to fight under dreadful pressure. Hittite chariots crashed against the hastily drawn lines of infantry defending the camp. Egyptians who had never before seen their king in direct danger now watched him ride close to the front, shouting encouragement, calling upon Amun to witness that he was not the one who had failed. The air was filled with the hiss of arrows, the cries of wounded men, and the scream of horses. The fate of the day turned on whether reinforcements would arrive in time. According to Egyptian accounts, a contingent of troops known as the Nerin, possibly local allies from the region of Amuru who had pledged themselves to Egypt, arrived on the field at a decisive moment. They struck the flanks of the Hittite chariot corps just as those heavy vehicles were beginning to lose cohesion after their first furious charges. At the same time, elements of the shattered Ra division may have regrouped within the camp perimeter, stiffening the defense. Now the Hittite charioteers found themselves hemmed in and under fire from many sides rather than charging an unsuspecting column. What is certain is that by sunset, the Hittite attack had spent itself. Some of their chariots had been destroyed. Others had retreated back across the river, laden with whatever plunder they had seized from the Ra division. The Egyptian camp still stood. Ramesses was alive. His remaining troops had held their ground. Yet Kadesh still loomed in the distance, its walls and towers untouched. The Hittite infantry and reserves were still in the area. Each side had bloodied the other, and neither had achieved the clear victory it desired. That night, in the Egyptian camp, the mood must have been somber and tense. Fires burned low as wounded men groaned, and physicians moved among them. Scribes sat with oil lamps, trying to capture in hurried lines of hieratic script the events of the day before memories blurred. Soldiers and officers whispered about narrow escapes and about comrades who would not see the morning. Somewhere in that camp, Ramesses sat with his inner circle, weighing his options. He could risk another full-scale engagement in the hope of breaking Mu'tali's army entirely. Or he could recognize that his forces were now far from their base, that supplies were limited, and that a withdrawal that preserved his core troops might serve Egypt better in the long run. In the days that followed, he chose not to throw everything into a renewed assault on Kadesh. Instead, he maneuvered, tested the enemy, and eventually marched his army back toward the south. From the Hittite perspective, this retreat could be claimed as a strategic success. The city of Kadesh remained in their orbit. From the Egyptian perspective, the fact that the army and its king fought off a dangerous ambush and returned home in order was proof of resilience and divine favor. Both sides would shape the story to fit their needs. Ramesses in particular understood the power of narrative. Once back in Egypt, he began to transform the raw experience of that day into something that would speak not of confusion and narrow escape, but of personal heroism. On the walls of major temples from Thebes to the Delta, he ordered the carving of detailed battle scenes. These show the marching columns, the camp, the assault of the Hittite chariots, and above all the central figure of the king as a tireless warrior who single-handedly halts the enemy flood. Alongside the pictures, scribes carved a long text, often called a poem, that recounts the battle in lofty language. In this version, Ramesses stands almost alone against vast numbers, chiding his cowardly troops, even as he calls upon Amun to steady his hand. In shaping this record, he was doing more than flattering himself. He was instructing his successors and his subjects in how a king should behave under pressure. The details of surprise and misjudgment were not useful to that lesson, so they faded into the background. The courage of the king and the eventual survival of the army took center stage. In politics, as in war, what people believed about an event could matter as much as what actually happened. Ramesses, who had felt the sickening moment when his camp seemed on the brink of being overrun, now ensured that his memory of that day would be the memory that others held as well. The Battle of Kadesh, as we call it now, did not end the rivalry between Egypt and Hatti. In the following years, Ramesses returned to Syria more than once. He led forces that besieged and captured other towns that had aligned themselves with the Hittites. At Dapur in the region of Amurru, he is shown in reliefs assaulting high walls with scaling ladders while his sons fight beside him, small figures with sidelocks of youth who are already being depicted as warriors. The sight of the king's children joining him in battle further bound his family image to that of the state. There were campaigns where the work was less dramatic, but no less important. Garrison towns had to be resupplied. Local rulers had to be reminded of their obligations. Paths for caravans had to be kept secure. Each marching season that took Ramesses north drained resources, but also reaffirmed Egypt's presence in the region. Over time, however, it became clear that neither Egypt nor Hatti could entirely dislodge the other from the contested lands. Kadesh itself remained a symbol of that stubborn stalemate, still standing on its river loop, still bearing witness to passing armies. In the quiet moments between campaigns, Ramesses would have had time to reflect on what the years of marching and fighting had yielded. His own reputation as a warrior had grown. His troops now knew him, not as a distant figure, but as a leader who had faced real danger beside them. The world beyond Egypt also knew his name, in fear or in respect. Yet the map of power in the north looked much like it had in his father's time. As he travelled back along the roads that led from Syria to Canaan and down into the delta, passing the same wells and way stations, whose names he now knew by heart, he may have begun to sense that true security for Egypt would require more than swords and chariots. The memory of Kadesh, with its clouds of dust, its near disaster, and its hard-fought stand, stayed with him. It would one day be joined, and perhaps balanced, by another memory, that of a day when the kings of Egypt and Hatti chose a different instrument to shape the future. There is a moment that comes to many rulers after the noise of battle has faded, when they turn from the dust of the frontier back toward their own river and their own cities, and ask themselves what will remain when the victories and defeats have all blurred together. For Ramesses, that question rose and settled in his mind as he sailed south on the Nile in the years after Kadesh. The river flowed past him with its usual calm authority. On both banks, farmers bent over their fields, tending barley and emmer. Children shouted and ran along the levees. The daily life of Egypt did not depend on what happened on the distant plains of Syria. It depended on water, on faith, and on the sense that the world was ordered as it should be. Ramesses understood that his answer to this quiet demand would not be found only in troop movements or treaties. It would be written into stone. The gods had given Egypt a gift that his predecessors had used with varying degrees of imagination. They had given it sandstone cliffs, granite quarries, and a people who knew how to turn raw rock into architecture and story. Now, with his throne secure and his name known in foreign courts, Ramesses decided to undertake something larger than any march of armies. He would remake the very face of Egypt. To grasp what that meant, it helps to picture the country as a long, narrow stage. The Nile runs like a spine through its center. On the west bank at Thebes rise the cliffs that guard the royal necropolis. On the east bank stand the temples of the living gods. North in the delta, channels branch and rejoin, forming fertile islands of settlement. Along this spine, Ramesses set out to place markers of his existence so numerous and so imposing that no traveller could ever doubt who had ruled in his time. He began, as many sons do, in the shadow of his father. Seti had left unfinished works at Thebes and Abydos. Ramesses travelled to these sites with the understanding that completing them was both a filial duty and a political act. At Abydos, in the temple that Seti had begun for Osiris, the walls were already alive with delicate reliefs. Scenes of offerings, of royal processions, of gods seated in serene conversation lined the halls. Ramesses ordered the remaining chambers to be completed. In one of the most famous halls of that temple, a long list of earlier kings was carved, with Ramesses standing beside his father and honoring the royal dead. It was a way of placing himself within a chain of legitimacy that stretched back to the earliest dynasties. At Karnak, the enormous temple complex of Amun, another inherited project awaited him. In the great hypostyle hall, a forest of stone columns rose toward the sky. Some had been erected under the earlier ruler Horemheb, others under Seti. Their capitals spread like papyrus blossoms, and shafts of light fell between them in pale beams. The lower registers of the walls already showed Seti, smiting enemies and presenting gifts to Amun. Ramesses oversaw the completion of this hall. He had his sculptors carve his own campaigns on the upper walls, including scenes of Kadesh, in which he appears enormous at the center of the panel, his chariot trampling enemies. Workers perched on scaffolding scores of feet above the ground, chipping away day after day until the stone seemed to bloom with figures. The sound of that work must have become a kind of constant breathing for the temple city. Hammer tapping against chisel, chisel biting into stone, commands shouted from foreman to crew. The slow rasp of files, smoothing sharp edges. In the heat of the day, the stone itself seemed to shift in color as dust gathered on its surface. At night, when the workers went home to their mud brick houses on the west bank at Deir el-Medina, the columns stood silent under the stars. The men and women who carved and painted for the king lived a life that we know more intimately than almost any other community in the ancient world, because their letters and complaints have survived on scraps of pottery and limestone. They wrote to one another about late payments, family illnesses, love affairs, and the weight of their tools. Through their words, we glimpse the human cost and effort behind the grand designs. Ramesses also turned his attention to the temple at Luxor, further south along the east bank of Thebes. There, an older shrine to Amun had been standing since the time of Amenhotep III. Ramesses added a great pylon at the entrance, flanked by colossal statues of himself and once fronted by a pair of tall obelisks. One of those obelisks still stands in Luxor today. Its twin was moved in a later age across seas and continents to a square in Paris, where it stands as a stranger under northern skies, still bearing the name of Ramesses. In his lifetime, those stone needles thrust into the bright air above the Nile. They framed the path by which the statue of Amun would be carried during festivals from Karnak to Luxor, a journey that united the two temples in ritual. If Thebes was the spiritual heart of his realm, the delta would be its nervous system and its outward face. Ramesses understood that the balance of power had shifted toward the north, where trade routes to Syria, Cyprus, and beyond passed through harbors and river mouths. He chose a region near older cities that had served the kings of the Second Intermediate Period and the early New Kingdom, an area whose waters and soils were already familiar to those who ran the chariot corps. There he ordered the building of his new residence city, Per-Ramessu. To imagine Per-Ramessu, think of a city built as both a palace and a military camp. The central district was dominated by the royal residence, with columned halls, open courts, and gardens watered by canals. Nearby stood the great stables that housed thousands of horses. Archaeologists who later dug in this area found evidence of enormous quantities of horse bones and remains of bronze fittings for chariots. It seems that the city was a center for the breeding, training, and equipping of the chariot forces that was so vital to Egyptian power in Asia. Alongside the palaces and stables stood temples. Some were dedicated to traditional Egyptian gods such as Amun and Ra. Others belonged to deities whose worship had spread from neighboring lands. Within Per-Ramessu there were shrines to Astarte, to Reshef, and to the god that Egyptians called Baal Zephon. Their presence in the royal capital shows that Ramesses did not try to seal Egypt off from foreign religious influences. Instead, he drew those gods into the symbolic landscape of his city. For foreign envoys who came to Per-Ramessu, it must have been both familiar and disorienting to see their own deities honored within the palace precincts of an Egyptian king. The streets of Per-Ramessu would have been filled with languages, Egyptian of course, in the speech of officials and scribes, but also tongues from Canaan, Hittite lands, and Nubia. Merchants arrived with goods from Cyprus and the Levant. Scribes from Byblos came to negotiate timber shipments. Artisans from Syria offered luxury products. Ramesses wanted the world to come to him, and in this capital, positioned close to the eastern routes, he made that possible. Yet, no matter how busy the delta grew, Thebes retained a special place in Ramesses' imagination. On the west bank, opposite the city, where the cliffs rise like a stone curtain, each great pharaoh of the New Kingdom had raised a mortuary temple to house his cult and to serve as a gateway between the worlds of the living and the dead. Thutmose, Amenhotep, and others had left their marks there. Ramesses determined that his own temple would surpass them all. The site chosen for this project faced the river, within sight of the green floodplain and the distant pylons of Karnak. The builders laid out a plan that combined monumental grandeur with practical function. There would be a great first court where vast processions could gather. Beyond it lay hypostyle halls, storage chambers, and sanctuaries. There would be storerooms for grain and oil, offices where scribes counted offerings, and a house of life where learned men copied texts and trained new scribes. On its walls, the king would inscribe scenes of his victories and pious deeds. As the temple rose, a modern traveller would have recognized its focal point the moment they saw it. In front of the first court, facing the river, workers carved and erected colossal statues of Ramses, seated on his throne. Each colossus was carved from a single block of stone, transported with immense effort from quarries upriver. One such statue, now fallen and partially broken, still lies at the site that later visitors called the Ramesseum. In the 19th century of our era, travelers stared up at its recumbent head and shoulders and spoke of it as the fallen giant that inspired a famous poem about shattered power. In Ramesses' own time, however, that statue stood upright, its gaze level across the floodplain. People approaching the temple by boat would have seen the king, larger than any human, waiting to receive them in stone form before they ever entered the courts where his priests prayed. Inside the Ramesseum, artists painted scenes in vivid color. There were panels that showed the pharaoh in the battle at Kadesh, driving his chariot into swarming enemies. Others showed him in a more peaceful role, offering incense and wine to Osiris, to Amun, to Ra-Harakti. In a side room, scribes copied wisdom texts and tales. Some of the stories that have survived on papyrus, like the one about a shipwrecked sailor who meets a talking serpent on a magical island, may have been read aloud in this temple, their lessons and entertainments woven into the daily rhythms of cult life. The building program of Ramesses did not stop at Egypt's borders. South of Aswan, where the Nile flows between high cliffs and the river narrows, lay Nubia. The kings of Egypt had long claimed control over this region, in part because of the gold that could be dug from its deserts. Ramesses saw it as an essential flank of his empire. To secure it, he did not rely only on garrisons. He carved temples into the very cliffs. The most famous of these southern monuments stand at a place we know as Abu Simbel. There, workers cut directly into a sandstone cliff overlooking the river. They created a vast facade with 4 seated figures of the king, each more than 60 feet tall. The faces are calm, the bodies broad-shouldered, the crowns perched atop heads that seem to survey the world with a steady, somewhat distant gaze. Between their legs, like children among the knees of a parent, stand smaller figures of the king's queen and children. Inside the rock, a series of halls and side chambers stretches back toward an inner sanctuary. The walls of the main hall are covered with scenes of military triumph. We see Ramesses in his chariot, again at Kadesh and in campaigns in Nubia. The message to those who entered was clear. The god-king, whose statues towered overhead, was also a victorious warrior who had brought order and prosperity through force of arms. In the innermost sanctuary stand 4 seated statues: Ra-Harakati, Amun, Ptah, and Ramesses himself. Twice each year, on particular mornings, The rising sun sends a shaft of light into this sanctuary, illuminating the faces of all but Ptah, a god associated with the depths and with the underworld. Light touches the stone face of Ramesses in the company of the gods. Whether this alignment was the result of deliberate design and careful solar observation, or a fortunate coincidence refined during construction, the effect must have been stunning. It offered a powerful visual reinforcement of the idea that the pharaoh shared in the cosmic power of the Sunday. Beside this great temple, Ramesses built a smaller one dedicated to his chief queen, Nefertari. On its facade, she appears nearly as tall as the king, an honor rarely granted to royal women in Egyptian art. The dedication inscription speaks of her as one for whom the sun rises. Inside, scenes show her in the company of the goddess Hathor. For the Nubian communities along this stretch of the Nile, the pair of temples at Abu Simbel announced that Egypt's royal family had come to dwell in the very rock above their river. Further north in Nubia, at places such as Beit el-Wali, Gerf Hussein, and Der, Ramesses ordered the construction of additional shrines. Their walls bear scenes of him smiting Nubian chiefs under the gaze of the gods, but they also show more mundane activities: the bringing of tribute, the presentation of exotic animals, the display of products from the south. Through these images, he told a story that bound Nubia into the narrative of his reign as both a conquered land and a valued source of wealth. Back in Egypt proper, his building activity continued in a steady rhythm. In Memphis, he restored and expanded temples of Ptah. Along the Nile, he erected way stations where the bark of Amun or other divine images could rest during festivals. In smaller towns and villages, local shrines sometimes received new gateways or statues provided by the king. These acts were not merely decorative. Each new structure or inscription established a point of contact between the community and the royal house. When villagers came to pray in a chapel and saw the name of Ramesses carved on its lintel, they were reminded that their piety was connected to the wider fabric of the state. There was also an element of possessive fervor in his approach to the past. In several temples, archaeologists have found older reliefs whose original royal names have been carefully cut out and replaced with those of Ramesses. To modernize, this may seem like theft. To him it was a way of renewing the monument and asserting that he stood in the tradition of his predecessors. By attaching his name to ancient stones, he both honored and overshadowed the kings who had first raised them. The sheer scale of this building program required careful management of resources. Stone had to be quarried in the south and shipped north. Timber was needed for scaffolding and for the sledges that moved colossal statues. Bronze tools wore out and had to be replaced. The state demanded labor from the villages along the Nile, calling men away from their fields during certain seasons. Taxes collected in grain and goods were redirected to feeding gangs of workers. The scribes of the central administration tracked all of this with alarming precision. One can imagine neat columns of hieratic script on papyrus rolls, listing how many men were assigned to which project, how much bread they were allotted each day, and how many blocks of sandstone remained to be carved. For the ordinary Egyptian, the reign of Ramesses would have been felt in small but memorable ways. A farmer might see a detachment of labourers from his village marched off under an overseer to work on a temple foundation. A boatman might be recruited to help to an obelisk upriver. A child in a provincial town might look up one year to see a new doorway in the local shrine, its lintel carved with the image of the king offering incense. During major festivals, crowds would travel to the great temples, where they would watch processions of priests carrying divine statues past colonnades that were now dominated by the face and name of Ramesses. The king himself moved among these works like an inspector and a proud patron. We can picture him arriving at Thebes by river, stepping ashore in a ceremonial barge and walking into the Ramesseum while work was still in progress. The foremen hurry to meet him, linen garments freshly laundered, hands still white with stone dust. They point out newly carved scenes, still unpainted, and propose additions. The king nods, asks questions about progress, and perhaps orders that another line of reliefs be added, showing his victories in lands that had not yet been mentioned. He knows that his life will one day end. The stone must speak for him when he can no longer speak for himself. At Per-Ramessu, he might have walked through his stables, watching rows of chariots drawn up in perfect order. Above the doorways, plaques recorded his titles in long phrases that praised his strength and his favor with the gods. In the evening he could move from the noise of the military quarter into the quiet of a temple court where priests conducted evening hymns. In this city of his own making, he could feel that the borders between royal authority, divine approval, and military power were as close as the walls that separated one precinct from another. Ramesses reigned long enough to see some of his own monuments begin to show their age. Sand drifted into corners, paint faded on exposed surfaces. Cracks appeared in columns and statues, which his masons patched and reinforced. The realization that even stone was not truly permanent must have come to him in moments, like a slight chill in the evening air. Yet he persisted in building, as if the answer to decay was more creation. In his case, it was a strategy that would succeed beyond his lifetime. Centuries later, when other dynasties had risen and fallen, when new invaders had come, and when some of his own cities had been abandoned and their building stones reused elsewhere, travelers still found his name. Greek visitors in the late period saw huge statues at Thebes and spoke of a mighty king whom they called Ozymandias. They knew nothing of his campaigns in Syria. They knew little of his treaties. What stood before them, sun-bleached and partly broken, were the monuments he had raised. Those stones outlasted the language in which they had been named. In the years when Ramesses was most active as a builder, however, he did not yet know how his story would ultimately be told. He only knew that as long as the quarry sounded, as long as the river could bear one more obelisk or statue, as long as his artisans at Deir el-Medina could still carve and paint, his presence would grow more solid in the land of Egypt. The clang of his hammers and the murmur of his priests became as much a part of the landscape as the call of birds over the marshes and the rush of water against the banks. It was from this position of stone-anchored authority, and from a capital that looked outward toward Asia, that Ramesses began to consider a different way of securing Egypt's place in the world. One that would draw on ink rather than bronze, on oaths rather than charges of chariots. By the time the dust of Kadesh had settled and the scars of that hard-fought day were fading from his soldiers' arms and minds, Ramesses had learned something that many conquerors find only after years on campaign. There are frontiers that cannot easily be pushed back by force alone. The land between the Nile and the great bend of the Euphrates was full of stubborn cities and powerful kingdoms. No single march or siege would ever silence all of its rival voices. When he returned to Egypt after those northern campaigns, the river greeted him in its usual unhurried way. The Nile does not care who holds Kadesh. It rises with the rains far to the south, spills into the fields, then retreats, leaving rich mud on which farmers coax crops from the soil. In that quiet rhythm, the king found both reassurance and a challenge. The people working along the banks needed peace as much as victory. The temples he had filled with his name, the granaries he had stocked, the stables he had built in Paramesu, all of these depended on steady seasons and dependable trade. To secure that, Ramesses began to look north, not as a hunter intent on the next raid, but as a statesman trying to imagine a steadier arrangement. Far beyond the forests of Lebanon, in the highlands of Anatolia, the Hittite king now sat on his throne with worries of his own. Muwatalli, who had faced Ramesses at Kadesh, had died. His son Uri-Teshub had been pushed aside by an uncle, Hattusili, a seasoned general who seized the crown and then had to defend it. To the east, Assyria was growing more restless and ambitious. There were fires on the edges of his world too. In such a climate, both great courts began to see that the ground between them might serve better as a shared margin than as a battlefield. We know this in part because of letters that have survived on clay tablets from Hittite archives, and in part from the proud inscriptions that Ramesses carved in stone. At some point in his 21st regnal year, the two kings moved beyond cautious feelers and agreed that the time had come for a formal settlement. The negotiations themselves must have been an intricate dance. There were no telephones or instant messages to send terms back and forth. There were couriers who traveled for weeks over mountains and through deserts, carrying sealed tablets and rolls of papyrus. There were interpreters at both courts who tried to catch every nuance of a foreign phrase. There were scribes who drafted and redrafted, aware that each word could bind their kings in the eyes of the gods. In Egypt, when Ramesses examined the proposed clauses, he did so with the experience of a man who had seen the sudden rush of chariots at Kadesh. He wanted more than fine words. He wanted a document that would stand between his people and another furious charge. In Hatti, Hattusili wanted security from Egyptian interference in his contested cities, and perhaps assistance if Assyria chose a moment of weakness to attack. Their interests overlapped in an unexpected way. Each needed a strong partner as much as a fearsome rival. The result of these cautious exchanges was a treaty that would later be praised as one of the earliest known peace agreements between great powers. Written first in the Hittite language on silver tablets in their capital city, it was then translated into Akkadian, the common diplomatic tongue of the region, and sent to Egypt. There, scribes rendered its words into Egyptian, recasting the names of foreign gods and kings into forms that fit their own sacred landscape. If we listen carefully, we can almost hear that text being read aloud for the first time in the great hall of Per Ramesu. The room is cool and shaded, its columns painted with bright images of lotus and papyrus. Ramesses sits on a throne of carved wood and ivory. In front of him stands a royal scribe, holding a roll of papyrus. Around them stand princes, generals, priests, and envoys. The scribe unrolls the document and begins to speak in a formal tone. The treaty opens by calling both kings great rulers, blessed by their gods. It states that there will be peace and brotherhood between them forever. It declares that neither Egypt nor Hatti will attack the other or seize each other's land. It lists the names of gods who are called upon to witness these promises, gods from both pantheons. Amun and Ra are invoked alongside the storm gods and sun gods of Anatolia. Even the mountains and rivers are named as witnesses, which in that world gave the text the weight of nature itself. There is a section that speaks of fugitives. If a man of rank or a prince flees from Hatti to Egypt, or from Egypt to Hatti, the receiving king will return him unharmed to his rightful lord. He must not be punished harshly when he is brought back. This sounds to modern ears like a cold calculation, but to those who heard it then, it was a signal that the two thrones respected each other's inner order. There would be no shelter offered for ambitious exiles who tried to stir trouble across the border. Another clause promises mutual assistance. If a foreign power attacks Egypt, Hatti will send troops or chariots or other aid. If Hatti is threatened, Egypt will do the same. In modern terms, we might call this a defensive alliance. For Ramesses and Hattusili, it was a way to keep Assyria and other rising forces from taking advantage of their own long rivalry. When the reading is finished, the scribe lowers the papyrus and waits. In the silence, everyone looks to Ramesses. The treaty, once accepted, will bind him not only to Hattusili, but to the gods whose names fill the margins of the text. It will also serve as a message to his own subjects. A king who signs such an agreement is saying that he trusts his power enough to share the stage with others. Ramesses nods and speaks words of acceptance. He agrees that this treaty will stand and that he will honor it. Copies of the text will be carved onto stone stelae and set up in temples, where priests will see them during rituals and where the gods themselves, in the minds of the worshippers, can read what their king has vowed. At Karnak, at Luxor, and in other sacred sites, the hieroglyphic version appears, framed by images of Ramesses and of Hittite envoys shaking hands under the approving gaze of divine figures. For the first time, the frontier that had been a stage for sudden charges and ambushes becomes a line supported on both sides by law and promise. It does not end all conflict or erase every grudge in the region, but it changes the tone of relations between the Nile and Anatolia. In the years that follow, Egypt and Hatti will turn their attention more often to other threats. They will exchange not arrows, but letters and gifts. One of the most powerful gifts a king can send to another is a member of his own family. In the age of Ramesses, royal women are among the most important instruments of diplomacy. They cross borders not as captives, but as living bridges between houses. In the wake of the peace treaty, the idea of a marriage alliance rises naturally from the correspondence between the two courts. From Hatti comes a proposal that one of Hattusili's daughters should become a wife of Ramesses. It is a remarkable suggestion, given the history between their peoples. The daughter of the man who once served as a general in battles against Egypt will now share the bed and the roof of the king, whose chariots have ridden against Hittite walls. The journey of that princess is itself a story. She leaves the rocky uplands of her home, where summers are cool and winters can bring snow, and travels south and west along caravan routes. She passes through towns that pay homage to her father, through borderlands that once echoed with the clash of spears, and finally enters the lands where the Nile begins to make its cold, slow way from the delta toward the sea. The air grows warmer, the fields change their crops, the styles of dress shift. The speech around her becomes more musical, filled with different consonants. When she reaches Egypt, there is a carefully staged welcome. At Per Ramessu, banners fly from walls and standards are carried in the streets. Musicians play sistrums and harps. Ramesses appears in full ceremonial dress to greet her. In the reliefs that later show such scenes, he is always taller than those around him, a deliberate artistic convention. In the moment itself, he may have been struck, in some private corner of his mind, by the strangeness of it all. The daughter of his former enemy stands before him as a peace offering. The treaty carved in stone now has a human face. The Hittite princess receives an Egyptian name that we render as Mathor Neferur, a phrase that links her to the concept of truth and to the sun god. She is taught the rituals and expectations of an Egyptian great royal wife. Her attendants learn to move through the palace according to local custom. She may retain some of her own household shrines and practices, bringing with her small images of Anatolian gods that are now placed discreetly among Egyptian figures of Hathor and Amun. In this way, the diplomacy of courts creeps into the daily devotions of women in the palace. For Nefertari, the queen who has long been Ramesses' chief consort, this development introduces a new complexity into her world. She has shared his early years on the throne, borne him children, and seen her own image carved at his side on temple walls. Now a foreign princess arrives to share some part of that symbolic space. The record is quiet about any feelings of rivalry, but human nature suggests that there must have been a recalibration of affection and influence within the royal apartments. If you picture the women of the court gathered in shaded gardens of Per Ramessu, surrounded by date palms and pools stocked with fish, you can almost sense the mixture of curiosity and caution with which Egyptian noble women would have approached the new Hittite bride. They would ask about her homeland, its fashions, its festivals, its foods. They would observe the way she spoke with the king, the way he looked at her, and they would adjust their own positions accordingly. From the perspective of people in distant towns, these changes in the palace could seem very far away. What mattered more to them was the way the treaty and the marriage alliance softened the northern horizon. In the years after the peace agreement, there are fewer reports of large campaigns against Hatti. The roads leading to Syria still see troops and officials, but they also see merchants with fewer fears of being caught between two marching armies. Caravans carry copper, tin, timber, and wine along routes that are less often interrupted by sudden mobilizations. Ramesses does not lay down his sword completely. His reign is long, and trouble does not vanish from his borders. To the west, Libyan tribes continue to press against the delta. They move in waves, seeking new pastures, and attracted by the wealth they know lies behind Egyptian fortresses. At one point, the Libyans form alliances with groups known as sea peoples, whose ships threaten coastal towns. Ramesses responds, as a soldier of his line would. He gathers his army once more. The campaigns against these Western groups are recorded on temple walls and on stelae that describe how the king, now older but still resolute, confronts them. In one account, he boasts of cutting down their leaders and filling the valleys with their bodies. The details are stylized, as such royal inscriptions often are, but they contain a kernel of reality. Egypt cannot afford to neglect its border with the desert, any more than it can ignore the mountains of Syria. The treaty with Hatti frees him to focus on these threats, without worrying that a push in the west will be answered by a stab from the north. To the south, in Nubia, Ramesses continues the pattern of firm oversight that he had established earlier in his reign. The Viceroy of Kush, the King's son of Kush, as the title is known, rules there in the name of the pharaoh. This viceroy ensures that gold shipments continue to reach Egypt, that local temples remain loyal, and that any stirrings of independence are quickly addressed. The temples at Abu Simbel and at other Nubian sites, with their giant images of the king, serve as constant reminders that the Nile Valley belongs to Ramesses, from its mouths to its cataracts. Inside Egypt itself, the years of relative peace with Hatti bring changes that are more subtle than the march of armies, but no less significant. With fewer large campaigns in Syria, fewer men are called away for extended periods. The state still claims labor for temple building and for maintenance of canals, but the grinding strain of endless war eases. Priests conducting rituals at Karnak or at Memphis can now recite the treaty clauses as part of their praise of the king, adding the role of peacemaker to the list of his virtues. In Per Ramesu, foreign envoys begin to appear more often as guests than as potential spies. Messengers from Hatti arrive, with tablets bearing friendly letters from Hattusili and his queen Puduhepa, who is herself a formidable political actor. The letters address Ramesses as brother and speak of the health of their families and their shared concerns about neighbors. Gifts travel back and forth. Fine textiles, metalwork, and horses cross the border. It is a very old version of something that feels familiar in later history, that slow knitting together of elites through correspondence and exchange. For Ramesses, these written words have a special power. He has experienced how fragile messages can be when carried by the mouths of men. At Kadesh, he learned how easily a lie or a half-truth can lead an army into danger. Now he sees in these inked lines a different sort of weapon and a different sort of shield. Once a treaty text is carved in stone in the precinct of Ammon, once a letter is sealed with a royal seal and stored in an archive, it becomes part of the architecture of power. Breaking such texts brings not only earthly condemnation, but the curse of the gods whose names stand as witnesses. The peace with Hatti lasts for the rest of his life. Other events will bring change to the eastern Mediterranean in generations to come, but for Ramesses, the long rivalry that had defined the early part of his reign settles into a pattern of wary respect and public harmony. When he looks at the northern sky from his palace roof, he no longer sees only the direction from which chariots might descend. He also sees a path along which princes can travel to marry his children, and along which messages of goodwill move between capitals. The older he grows, the more closely he can weave his diplomatic and domestic worlds together. The Hittite princess becomes not only a symbol of peace, but a member of a large and complicated household that includes Egyptian queens, princes, and princesses. Their children and stepchildren grow up in courtyards that ring with multiple languages, learning to navigate both the inner politics of the palace and the outer politics of a region that has finally, for a while, found a balance of power. At night in Per Ramessu, lamps burn in the windows of the royal apartments. Somewhere in those rooms, Ramesses sits with trusted scribes and advisors, reading or listening to the latest letters from Hatti and from other courts. In other chambers, his wives and concubines talk quietly, or sing, or watch their children sleep. The world beyond the palace walls is never entirely free of danger, but the sense of imminent crisis that once surrounded Kadesh has lifted. A different rhythm has taken hold, one that allows for long plans and for the slow weaving of family and state. In this atmosphere, the king begins to spend more time thinking about the people closest to him, about the sons who will one day inherit the complex web of treaties, temples, and memories he has created, and about the women who share his name and his house. In the cool hours before sunrise, when the courtyards of Per Ramessu were still mostly quiet, and the lamps along the colonnades burned with a gentle yellow light, the heart of the empire beat not only in the throne room or the audience hall, but in the inner chambers where Ramesses lived among his family. The image that the world saw of him was framed in stone and paint, a towering figure who smote enemies and offered incense to the gods. Yet behind the stone faces and formal titles, there was a man who moved through a dense forest of relationships, bound by affection, duty, and calculation to an astonishing number of wives and children. For anyone who walked through the palace, the scale of that family would have been impossible to ignore. Servants carrying trays of bread or jugs of beer stepped aside, not just for the king, but for princes and princesses who seemed to multiply with each passing year. In the courtyards, there were always children at play, running with pet monkeys, tumbling with dogs, practicing with toy bows, or following tutors with wax tablets under their arms. Scribes who tried to keep track of them all eventually produced lists that leave modern scholars shaking their heads. Ramesses probably fathered more than 100 children. It is a number that sounds almost mythical, yet the walls of his temples and tombs repeat the images of sons and daughters until the pattern becomes clear. At the center of this teeming household stood a woman whose name has echoed down the centuries with unusual clarity. Nefertari Meritmut, whose name can be translated as beautiful companion, beloved of the goddess Mut, was the chief queen during the early part of Ramesses' reign. In carved reliefs, she appears with an elegance that even the passage of time has not quite worn away. Her face is refined, her posture assured, and her titles speak both of royal dignity and of personal favor. Nefertari was more than a decorative presence at the king's side. She played a role in public life that we can still glimpse in letters sent between the Egyptian court and foreign rulers. In one surviving tablet from the archives of a Near Eastern palace, Nefertari writes to the queen of a neighboring kingdom with the tone of an equal, sending gifts and polite concern. Her words move alongside those of her husband in the wider world of diplomacy. Within Egypt, she appears beside Ramesses on temple walls, sometimes almost equal in height to him, a visual claim that her person shared in the radiance of the throne. No monument speaks more clearly of the esteem in which she was held than the smaller temple at Abu Simbel. While the larger rock-cut shrine is dedicated to Ramesses himself and to the gods Amun and Ra-Harakhti, the second temple is dedicated to Nefertari and to Hathor. On its facade, 6 standing figures are carved. 4 are of the king, but 2 are of Nefertari, and they are nearly the same height as his. For a royal woman in Egyptian art, this is a rare honor. Above the doorway, an inscription calls her the one for whom the sun shines. In the Valley of the Queens at Thebes, Nefertari was given a tomb that remains one of the most beautiful ever created. When modern archaeologists first descended into its chambers, they found walls covered with scenes in which the queen appears in gleaming white garments, her skin painted a warm reddish tone, her jewelry picked out in bright blues and golds. She stands before gods, plays senate in the presence of a deity, and passes through the rituals that promise rebirth. The clarity and freshness of these paintings suggest the care with which her burial was planned. For Ramesses to devote such resources to her tomb tells us something about the depth of his feeling and the importance of her role. Yet, even as Nefertari flourished, the royal household expanded outward to include other great wives. Among them was Isetnofret, another queen whose sons would later play crucial parts in the story of succession. Where Nefertari seems to shine in the religious and diplomatic sphere, Isetnofret appears more often in contexts linked to the practical future of the dynasty. Her son Merneptah, for example, would eventually inherit the throne when Ramesses was gone. For much of his life, he lived in the shadow of many older brothers, but his mother's status and his own steady presence at court prepared the way for his later role. It is important to understand that in the world of Ramesses, marriage was seldom a purely private matter. Royal wives carried the weight of alliances, both inside Egypt and beyond. Some of them were daughters of noble families whose loyalty the king wished to secure. Others were foreign princesses, like the Hittite bride who arrived after the Great Peace Treaty. These women did not simply vanish into an anonymous harem. They brought with them their own customs, servants, and sometimes their own small household shrines. They learned Egyptian court etiquette and language, but they also introduced new threads into the tapestry of palace life. There were also royal daughters who crossed the line from one role to another. In Egypt, as in several other ancient kingdoms, marriage within the royal family was not taboo in the way that it is for many of us today. Ramesses had several daughters who became consorts as well as children. Bintenath, whose name appears on monuments, is one such figure. She is shown both as a daughter of the king and as a great royal wife. Another daughter, Meritamen, appears in a similar double role in some contexts. These unions were less about romance than about the idea that the king's blood, seen as sacred, should circulate within a closed circle. To later eyes this can be startling, but in the logic of the time, it was a way of reinforcing the divine aura of the royal house. Within this complex web of spouses and offspring, the everyday life of the court unfolded in a pattern shaped by ritual and habit. In the morning, Ramesses would leave his private quarters and enter public spaces where audiences were held. Petitioners from all over Egypt might stand in long rows, waiting for the chance to be heard. Viziers and scribes presented reports. Foreign envoys offered gifts. All of this is the world that inscriptions normally show us. Yet, when the formal business of the day ended, the king did not walk into a vacuum of silence. He returned to rooms where children laughed, where wives and mothers exchanged news and gossip, where small rivalries and deep bonds were acted out in gestures that left no mark on stone. Imagine one of those evenings. In a shaded courtyard of Per Ramesu, with painted columns surrounding a garden pool, Nefertari sits with several of her daughters. The girls are dressed in fine linen, their hair braided and adorned with perfume cones of scented fat that slowly melt in the heat. Nefertari watches them play a board game or listen to a musician plucking at a harp. Across the way, Isetnefret walks with her sons, speaking quietly to Meneptah about his duties. Servants move in and out with trays of figs, pomegranates, and wine in golden cups. Somewhere in these same quarters, the Hittite princess and her attendants speak softly in a language that is still foreign to most of the household. For the royal children, the palace is both playground and school. The boys in particular are groomed from an early age for roles that combine privilege and burden. They learn to read and write, to recite hymns, and to understand the rituals that frame kingly power. As they grow older, they join their father in processions and hunts. In temple reliefs, we see several of them marching behind Ramesses, small but serious figures carrying standards or weapons. They are given titles such as royal scribe, general of the chariotry, or high priest. They are posted as overseers of works, commanders of garrisons, and guardians of important shrines. One son stands out in the surviving record for his particular character. Khaim Waset, a child of Isetnefret, grew up to become high priest of Ptah in Memphis, the old royal city near the apex of the delta. In this role, he had great influence over religious and economic affairs in Lower Egypt. But it is not only his office that draws attention. In inscriptions from later in his life, Khaim Waset appears as someone who took an unusual interest in the monuments of earlier kings. He is credited with restoring and reinscribing decrepit temples and pyramids, and with leaving notes on some of them that identify their ancient builders. Modern writers have sometimes called him the first archaeologist, though that label is our own invention. In his own mind, he was probably acting as a responsible priest, preserving the memory of past rulers and reinforcing the sense of continuity that his father prized so deeply. If Khaim Waset represents a thoughtful, almost scholarly side of the royal family, other sons were more firmly planted in the world of war. The princes Amun, her Khepeshef, and Ramesses, for instance, appear with their father in scenes of battle. They drive chariots behind his, they stand in the front ranks during sieges, and they share in the ceremonial presentations of captives and booty. In some reliefs, they are depicted using the same gestures of smiting that their father does, a visual rehearsal for the possibility that they might one day take his place. The problem that ran beneath all this careful grooming, however, was simply the number of potential heirs. In a family where dozens of sons survive into adulthood, questions of succession cannot help but become complicated. Ramesses seems to have named an heir at various points in his reign, often one of his older sons, only to outlive him. The throne, in a sense, kept slipping from one pair of hands to another while the father still sat upon it. By the time he reached his old age, several of those once promising princes had already gone to their tombs. We can picture Ramesses in his later years, perhaps in his 7th or 8th decade, looking at a row of statues in a family chapel, each one representing a son who had died before him. He had given them commands, lands, and titles. He had taken them with him to battle and to ceremony. Yet the simple arithmetic of mortality had removed them one by one from the field. Merneptah, who had been a younger son with less obvious prospects at the start, rose steadily in prominence as others disappeared. Eventually, he became the designated successor, holding important offices and acting as co-regent in the closing part of his father's reign. The court itself would have felt these losses. Every royal funeral meant a period of mourning, a ripple of reassigned offices, and a shift in the delicate balance of influence among mothers and siblings. For the wives of Ramses, their fortunes often rose and fell with those of their children. A queen whose son stood close to the succession enjoyed a different standing than one whose children had died or had been overshadowed. This meant that behind the courteous exchanges of the inner chambers, there was almost certainly a current of competition, managed with smiles but grounded in hard knowledge of how the world worked. The other side of royal intimacy was the presence of the harem. This word, shaped by later languages, can mislead if we imagine it only as a cluster of idle women. In the Egypt of Ramesses, the Perchene, or harem, was a significant institution that included not only wives and concubines, but also musicians, dancers, and servants who were part of the court's cultural life. They participated in festivals, served in cultic performances, and sometimes held lands that were administered in their name. The harem had its own internal hierarchy and its own officers. In another reign, generations later, plotters in the harem would try to overthrow a king. Under Ramesses, we do not have evidence of such drama, but the potential was always there in a community that gathered so many ambitious and closely connected people. Religion shaped the inner life of the palace as much as it did the outer life of the temples. Queens served as priestesses in the cults of goddesses. Daughters were given the title of Singer of Amun, or Hand of the Goddess. These roles were not empty. They required participation in ceremonies where the divine image was dressed, fed, and moved through the temple. In some cases, royal women acted almost as living embodiments of goddesses, their gestures and clothing mirroring those of Hathor or Mut. To be a wife or daughter of Ramesses was therefore not only to be close to a human ruler, it was to stand on the edge of a sacred stage where every action might be seen as part of the ongoing contact between the human and divine realms. The royal children themselves were told stories that reinforced this sense of belonging to something larger than any one person. They learned that their father was the living Horus, the falcon god on earth, and that his father before him had also worn that sacred mantle. At festival times they saw him emerge from the temple, bearing the regalia of kingship, his body and face shining with the oils and pigments of ritual. They walked behind him in processions that linked palace and shrine, city and countryside. To some of them, this pattern may have seemed natural, almost automatic. To others, especially those who felt the possibility of one day taking their place at the head of the line, the weight of it may have been almost frightening. Outside the walls, people in Egypt heard of the king's family through songs and prayers, as much as through official announcements. A farmer in Middle Egypt might not know the names of all the queens, but he would know that the king had many sons and daughters, and that this was taken as a sign of divine favor. A woman who came to a local shrine seeking help in childbirth might mention Nefertari or another queen as an example of fruitful motherhood. In steles set up by officials and soldiers, we sometimes find references to the honor of serving in the household of this or that royal son. The royal family, in this sense, was not only a private constellation of people, it was a public symbol of order, abundance, and continuity. Yet there were also moments when that symbol shifted in unsettling ways. When Nefertari died, probably in the middle part of Ramesses' reign, the absence of her presence must have been deeply felt. For years she had been the first figure at the king's side, in public scenes, the primary voice among his wives, the woman whose name was carved on cliffs beside his own. Now, though her tomb preserved her image in painted perfection, the living person was gone. Other wives stepped forward to occupy the spaces she had held, both physically and in the balance of the household. The temple at Abu Simbel ensured that people would remember her, but within the palace, new routines and new alliances formed. In the last decades of his life, the royal household had settled into a pattern that reflected both the enormous fertility of the king and the hard truths of age. Ramses himself suffered from ailments that time brings to most bodies. His teeth were worn, his joints probably ached, and he required assistance to move across long distances. The memory of his chariot, charges, and his hunts in the desert was preserved in art and in the stories told to his grandchildren. For those grandchildren, he was at once the living center of their world and a figure who seemed already halfway in the realm of legend. The palace of Per Ramesu thus became a place where several generations lived side by side under one roof. Old courtiers who remembered Seti shared corridors with young scribes who had never known any other king than Ramesses. Sons who had fought in Syria sat at meals with younger brothers, born long after the peace with Hatti. Daughters who had watched their mothers navigate the politics of the harem now did the same for their own children. The lines linking them all together ran through one man whose face looked down on them, not only from the head of the table, but from the statue bases and lintels of the rooms they crossed every day. From the outside, later generations would remember that face and that name more than any single domestic detail. They would speak of Ramesses the Great as a conqueror and a builder. Yet those who walked in his halls knew him as a father and a husband as well, a man whose personal life was inseparable from the destiny of a country. His family was an institution, and his household was a mirror in which the strengths and tensions of his reign could be seen on an intimate scale. As the light of his life began to soften and lengthen toward evening, those closest to him would have been keenly aware that sooner or later the center of their world would shift. The man who had filled Egypt with his children and his monuments would one day leave them to manage the inheritance. In that knowledge, the conversations in the quiet corners of the palace became more thoughtful, the glances between mothers and sons more weighted, the prayers whispered in family chapels more urgent. By the time the sun of his life began to lean toward the horizon, Ramesses had outlasted almost everyone who had shared his youth. Generals who had ridden beside him at Kadesh had gone to their tombs. Many of the sons who had marched in neat rows behind his chariot had followed them. The high priests who had welcomed him as a young king at Karnak had been replaced by men who had been born during his reign. Egypt had never before known a ruler who stayed so long on the throne. When Ramesses entered the later decades of his reign, there were grown men in the villages of the Nile who could not remember another name in the royal cartouche. The rhythm of the year was marked for them by the rise and fall of the river, and by the festivals of the gods, and in all those rituals the same king appeared. His image was in their local shrines. His jubilees were celebrated in their town squares. His story had slipped from news into background, from novelty into the air itself. In the private spaces of his palace, time left clearer marks. The strong limbs that had drawn a bow at Kadesh and climbed the ladder at Dapur now moved more slowly. His teeth, worn by the coarse bread that was every Egyptian's daily food, troubled him. His spine began to curve. From the studies done on his mummy much later, We know that he suffered from arthritis in his hips and back. In life, that would have meant mornings that started stiff and painful, days in which the length of a hallway looked longer than it once had. He adapted, as people do. Where once he had mounted a chariot with ease, now he rode more often in litters, borne by servants, or in comfortable barges along the river. Audiences were held in rooms whose floors were smooth and level. The throne that he had once bounded up to now stood at the top of a small ramp. But the changes in his gait did not erase the authority in his voice or the force of habit that made others bow when he entered. In the great festivals, when he still appeared before the people and the gods in full regalia, the contrast between the idealized images of him on the walls and the older man who walked beneath them must have been striking. On the temple reliefs he remained forever tall and broad-shouldered, his arms still taut with muscle, his stride long and assured. The sculptors did not carve wrinkles or stooped backs on living kings. Yet those who attended the ceremonies could see both versions at once. They saw the eternal Ramses in stone and the mortal Ramses in flesh, and they accepted the distance between them as part of the mystery of kingship. The longer he lived, the more he seemed to embody the very idea of Egypt for his subjects. Foreign envoys who came to Père Ramessu in his 80s would have been told stories of the days when he fought at Kadesh or when he ordered the carving of Abu Simbel. To them he appeared almost like an ancient oak in an old estate, his roots sunk so deep in the soil that they seemed part of the country itself. Administration under such a long-lived king settled into an intricate pattern. Much of the daily work of governing fell to his officials and to his chosen heir. Merneptah, now a seasoned man rather than a younger son in the crowd, served increasingly as the practical hand of the throne. He commanded troops, supervised building projects, and handled correspondence with foreign courts. In effect, Egypt had two kings working in tandem. One, the old lion, who still carried the full weight of divine status. The other, the successor, who learned the art of rule in the shadow of an extraordinary predecessor. For the priests of Amun, of Ptah, and of the other great gods, this period was one of relative stability. They knew who their royal patron was. They knew what he expected and what he would tolerate. Temple estates expanded, owning fields and flocks that needed careful management. Scribes in these institutions kept detailed records of offerings, land boundaries, and agreements with local officials. The machinery of the state moved with the slow assurance of something that had been operating for a very long time. Beyond Egypt, the world around the kingdom was beginning to change in ways that no one could fully see. Assyria watched the region with growing ambition. Peoples on the edges of the Mediterranean were shifting and stirring in ways that would one day produce the movements we call the invasions of the Sea Peoples. For the present, however, the treaty with Hatti still held. The correspondence between Ramesses and Hattusili, and later between their successors, continued. The border remained mostly quiet. In the palace, the passage of time was measured as much by absences as by events. One by one, familiar faces dropped away. Nefertari was gone. Other wives and daughters followed her path into the Valley of the Queens. Sons who once seemed destined to succeed their father met early deaths from disease or accident. Ramesses attended their funerals, as he had once attended his own father's. The embalmers worked over their bodies. Priests recited prayers for their safe passage into the next world. Each ceremony must have pressed upon him the fact that he was outliving not only his enemies, but many of his own children. There is a peculiar solitude that comes with great age. Even in a crowded household, the oldest person in the room sometimes feels as if they have crossed a small invisible river from the rest. They carry memories that no one else shares. For Ramesses, those memories included the sound of chariot wheels at Kadesh, the first sight of the cliffs at Abu Simbel before they were carved, the voice of Seti speaking to him when he was still a prince. When he looked at the younger members of his family, he was looking across a span of decades that had reshaped the world. At some point early in his 10th decade of life, the inevitable drew near. No contemporary text describes his final illness in detail. There are no bedside journals, no letters from physicians worrying over his pulse. Yet the pattern of royal burials and the condition of his mummy tell us that he did not die suddenly on a battlefield or in an accident. His end came in bed, attended by servants and priests who knew what to do when a king began to slip away. The palace would have grown very quiet in those days. Messengers went out from Per-Ramessu to Thebes and Memphis, alerting high priests and important officials that the moment was coming. In workshops in the Valley of the Kings, carpenters and painters worked more quickly on a tomb that had been under preparation for many years. In storerooms, items chosen for his burial were taken from shelves and checked. In the house of purification, the place where bodies were washed and prepared, the chief embalmers made ready for a task that was both a technical challenge and a sacred duty. When the breath finally left Ramesses, the stillness in his room would have felt heavy. Those present stepped back, bowed, and covered their heads. Outside, a wail might have risen from the women of the household, a formal cry of grief that signaled to the entire palace that the king was dead. Somewhere in the same building, Merneptah was already being addressed as king, because in Egypt, the throne could not remain vacant, even for a moment. The body of Ramesses was taken from the bed and moved to the place where the embalmers worked. Their craft had been refined over centuries. They began by washing the body with water from the Nile and with wine. They then removed the internal organs, placing them in containers that would accompany him in the tomb. The heart, believed to be the seat of thought and feeling, was often left in place to be weighed in the judgment of the dead against the feather of Ma'at. The brain was extracted through the nose, a procedure that sounds grisly to modern ears, but that the embalmers performed with practiced hands. The empty cavities were filled with linen and resin. The skin was treated with natron, a natural salt, to draw out moisture and prevent decay. For weeks the body lay in this dry embrace, slowly losing water and becoming light and firm. When the drying was complete, the embalmers anointed the skin with oils and perfumes. They wrapped the limbs and torso in linen strips, placing amulets between the layers. Each charm had a purpose, whether to protect a limb, to preserve speech, to grant safe travel through specific dangers of the underworld, or to help Ramesses join with the sun god on his daily journey. As they wrapped, priests recited spells from the corpus of texts that we sometimes call the Book of the Dead, though for an Egyptian, these were more like guides for the living, who were about to embark on another phase of existence. The face was covered with careful bands of linen. A mask, perhaps of gold or of cartonnage covered in gold leaf, may have been placed over the head, though the original mask of Ramesses has not survived. The final figure, wrapped and adorned, bore the marks of both the man and the myth. Meanwhile, in the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of Thebes, the tomb designated for Ramesses was being prepared to receive him. Cut deep into the bedrock, it extended through corridors and chambers that had been carved years earlier under his orders. The walls showed scenes of his journey through the night sky in the company of Ra. of his encounters with protective and terrifying beings in the realm beneath the earth, and of his rebirth at dawn. The ceilings were painted with stars, the hieroglyphs glowed with pigment. The funeral procession that carried him there would have been long and elaborate. Priests in leopard skin cloaks walked ahead, swinging censers of incense. Musicians played flutes and drums. Mourners tore their garments and threw dust upon their heads. The royal mummy lay in a coffin on a sled, which was drawn by teams of men along the road from the Nile to the valley. At certain points, the procession stopped for rituals that symbolically reenacted moments from the myth of Osiris, the god who had been killed and resurrected and who now ruled the underworld. At the tomb entrance, ceremonies took place that were meant to open the mouth of the deceased, to restore his senses so that he could eat, drink, and speak in the afterlife. Then the mummy was carried inside and placed in a series of nested coffins, and perhaps also in a stone sarcophagus, although that sarcophagus would later suffer damage and reuse. Around him were deposited the objects that a king was expected to have in eternity: furniture, chariots, statues, vessels of food and drink, and other offerings filled the chambers. Once everything was in place, workers sealed the doors and filled in the entrance with rubble and plaster. For a time, the tomb rested under the watch of the cliffs, quiet as a closed eye. The peace did not last. Grave robbing was as old as tomb building. Within a few generations, thieves tunneled into the royal sepulchres, seeking gold, jewelry, and precious materials. Priests and officials tried to stop them, sometimes even organizing official inspections and reburials when damage was discovered. The pressure of economic hardship in later times, and the lure of wealth concentrated in these hidden vaults, made the king's tombs irresistible targets. At some point, perhaps during the Third Intermediate Period, the authorities made a drastic decision. They would move the mummies of several great kings from their original tombs to secret caches where they could be better protected. Ramses was taken from his chamber and rewrapped. Together with other royal mummies, including those of Ahmose, Seti, and later pharaohs, he was laid in a communal hiding place in the cliffs above Deir el-Bahari. There, in a long shaft and side chamber buried under debris, the rulers of the new kingdom lay in forced companionship, their individual grand tombs compromised, their bodies now protected by anonymity. More than 2.5 millennia passed. Dynasties rose and fell. New religions reached the Nile. Greek, Roman, Arab, and Ottoman rulers came and went. The memory of Ramses survived in confused stories told by later visitors, who saw his statues and gave him new names. But the body of the man himself lay undisturbed in the secret cache, his linen wrappings darkened with age, his features still marked by the sharp nose and strong jaw that his sculptors had once rendered in stone. In the 19th century, when European scholars and adventurers turned their attention to the antiquities of Egypt, rumors began to circulate among local families about a hidden tomb containing many mummies. In 1881, Egyptian authorities, guided by information from a family of tomb robbers, turned informers, located the cache at Deir el-Bahari. When they entered the chamber, they found a jumbled but astonishing collection of coffins, each bearing the names of rulers once thought lost to time. Among them was Ramses. The journey of his mummy from that dark chamber to the lighted halls of museums is a story that would have bewildered any ancient Egyptian. He was unwrapped, inspected, and eventually placed on display. Archaeologists measured his bones and compared his features to the idealized statues that bore his name. They confirmed that he had indeed been a tall man for his time, and they saw the signs of the arthritis and dental problems that would have troubled his old age.